Hey guys, so I wanted to take a second to do a couple of examples of compound inequalities. Compound inequalities are going to look different than one variable equalities in the sense that you're going to have two. Compound meaning that you have two of them. So some definitions or some terms that you'll see, and is going to be the intersection. So you're going to solve the two equalities separately. And then once you've solved the inequalities separately, for and, you're going to find the overlap or where they intersect. For or, you're going to find the union, or the way that I remember it is you're going to unite them together. You're going to stick them together. You'll see the symbols down there. Some examples off to the right of your screen. We're going to work through these, but compound inequalities look different because there's two of them. So here's our first example. Negative 10 is less than 2x plus 4 less than 18. So with compound inequalities that look like this, you want to get x by itself. Now the difference here is x is sandwiched in between two inequalities. So I'm going to get x by itself the way that I always would. So I'm trying to get x by itself in here. I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides, but because it's compound, all three parts. So I've got negative 14 less than 2x, those cancel, less than 14. And then I'm going to go back to the center because I want to get x by itself. I'm going to divide everything by 2. Those are going to cancel and leave me with negative 7 is less than x less than 7. So how we read that as x is between negative 7 and 7. And so I graph that the same way that I read it. I'm going to put x between negative 7 and 7. I use the inequality closest to the number to determine if it's a parenthesis or bracket. So that one's going to be a parenthesis on negative 7. So there's negative 7. And then this inequality is going to tell me that it is a parenthesis on 7. And so then I'm going to shade in the middle because it's between those two numbers. And so there would be your graph. Interval notation, I do the graph first and then I go back and pick up interval notation. So interval notation is going to be from 7 to 7. And again, this stuff just came, that gave me the first part, and that gave me the second part. And these are the inequalities that told me whether it was a bracket or parenthesis. Now with that specific compound inequality, you're always going to shade in the middle because x is sandwiched in between. Here's example 2. Example 2 is 2x less than or equal to 3x minus 7, or 3 minus 4x is greater than 31. So in Hawks, they're going to ask me several different steps. Step 1 is going to say solve the first inequality and write an interval notation. So I went ahead and wrote down the first inequality. Well, to solve this, I would recommend moving all the x's to the left because it's going to make it easier on you when you go to graph it. So I'm going to move the x's to the left. So minus 3x minus 3x. Those are going to cancel. I'll have negative x is less than or equal to negative 7. Now to get rid of that negative sign in front, I need to divide by negative 1 on both sides. That's going to make those negatives cancel, and I'll be left with a 7 over there. Now, anytime you multiply or divide by a negative number, you are going to flip the inequality. And so we talked about that in the last video, but just as a reminder, flip the inequality. So there's my my inequality, I need the interval notation. So I go through the graph. Even though it didn't ask me for the graph, I'm going to go ahead and graph it. So there's 0 and 7. Just put it somewhere on your line. So with 7, it's going to have a bracket because it's got the or equal to. It's greater than or equal to. And then I'm going to shade to the right. And so my interval would be from 7 to infinity. Okay, so there's my first interval. Step 2 then says to solve this second inequality and write in interval notation. We've got 3 minus 4x is greater than 31. So I'm going to get x by itself. I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. Those will cancel. Greater than 28. And I'm going to divide by -4. Because I divided by -4, I need to flip my sign. So that's going to turn. And I'll be left with x is greater than -7. Sorry, x is less than -7 because I flipped it. So I'm going to write in interval notation, which I like to go through the graph, so I'm going to graph it too. There's 0, -7. I'm going to have a parenthesis on -7 because it's just less than, and then I'm going to shade to the left. So my interval is going to be -infinity to -7 with a parenthesis. So that is step 2. Step 3 then says, using everything from up above, combine it and solve for the overall inequality. So I went ahead and wrote down the 2 interval notations. Now because I'm looking for or is going to be the union or the uniting of them. So I'm going to take these 2 intervals and I'm going to stick them together. Now, I like to do the graph first, so I'm actually going to graph it and then go back and write the intervals so that we can see this. So the first graph, the inequality on the left, I'm going to do that one first in yellow. I've got 7 with a bracket, and 7 is going off to infinity. And then in green, I've got, I'm going to do this second one in green, -7 with a parenthesis going off to -infinity. And so my union, my uniting of them two is going to be that both of them together, because or means take both of them. To write this thing in interval notation, I have to write from left to right. So on the graph, if I was walking on the graph, the first thing I would come up with is -infinity to -7, union or 7 to infinity. And so where these things come from, that came from that part of the graph, that came from that part of the graph. And that union symbol is because it asked for or. It asked me to put them together. Okay, the last one, example 3, the last one on the video. -5 times y minus 2 less than or equal to 25 and 8 plus y less than 11. So first thing it asked me to do, solve the first inequality. And so I'm going to solve this thing. I'm going to distribute the -5. And I'll have -5y plus 10 when I multiply when I multiply both things by negative 5, is less than or equal to 25. I'm going to solve this. Minus 10, minus 10. Negative 5y is less than or equal to 15. Divide by negative 5 and get y and a negative 3. Because I divided by a negative number, I have to flip my inequality. Now they asked me for interval notation, and so I am going to go through the graph. So there's 0, there's negative 3. I'm going to put a bracket on negative 3 and then shade to the right. So my interval will be negative 3 with a bracket to positive infinity. Okay, so there's my first part. And then part 2 says to solve the second inequality. So I've got 8 plus y is less than 11. I'm going to minus 8 from both sides and get y is less than 3. I'm going to graph it and then use that to give me my interval notation. So there's 0, 3. Y less than 3 means I'm going to put a parenthesis on 3 and shade to the left. And so my interval will be negative infinity to 3 with a parenthesis. Okay, so there's my two intervals. Now step 3 says using the answers from the previous steps, solve the overall inequality, write in interval notation. So I went ahead and wrote the two inequalities that we just found. Now because the question says and, I am looking for where do these two graphs overlap. So different than or, you're sticking them together, and I'm looking for where do they overlap. So I'm going to do the graph first. I'm going to do the one on the left first in yellow. So I've got negative 3 to infinity with a bracket, and it is going to infinity and beyond. I then have the second one, negative infinity to 3. I'm going to do that one in green. So I've got negative infinity to 3, a parenthesis on 3, and then it is going to the left. Now, I'm looking for and, which is the overlap, and so I'm looking for where are they both? Where do the graphs overlap? And that happens right there. And so my final answer is this piece right here. That is the overlap. That would be the graph that you would put into Hawks. You would only have the graph of negative 3 to 3. That's the only part that you would have shaded. The rest of that was just how I arrived at the answer. My interval notation would be negative 3 to 3. So those would be my two answers.